Welcome to Learning MLA, Formatting, Citing, and Mechanics. Okay, what is MLA? Well, MLA stands for the Modern Language Association, which was founded in 1883. Different associations that represent different disciplines of study often have their own preferred rules for how to format texts and cite sources. The Modern Language Association is a documentation style usually used in humanities research. The humanities refers to disciplines like English, literature, languages, philosophy, and the fine arts. However, please use the style specified for your particular course, as instructors' preferences can differ even in these disciplines. Now, like with other documentation styles, it's ideal to use the latest version, and for MLA, that would be the 9th edition. This is a picture of the current handbook here. And this is the website where you can find the most up-to-date MLA information. Now let's begin with formatting and how to create an MLA paper. You may be familiar with the title page in APA, where you have the title of the essay and your personal information all on its own sheet. But it's less common to do this with MLA and more common to construct the first page of the paper with your personal information on the same page the essay begins. So on an empty first page, you'll first create your page number in a header with your surname. To get to the header, you'll have to double click or enter it through the Insert tab and then Header, Insert Header. Make sure to click back out of the header to add what comes next. Only your last name and the page number come in the header. And next you'll list 4 items on the left-hand side. Your name, your instructor's name, the name of the course, and the date formatted as day, month, year, without any punctuation. Now, it may be tempting to add extra information like your student ID number or the assignment number, but all that's included in MLA format are these 4 items. So only include these 4 unless your instructor asks for something else. And on the very next line, no extra spaces, goes your title. Now it's centered, but not bolded, just plain text. Remember to capitalize proper nouns and all the major words in the title. Your essay then begins on the very next line, again, with no extra spaces. You can see this paper is just double spaced, no extra space here, no extra space here. Just go to the next line. However, indent the first line by pressing the tab key, as you can see here. If you're not familiar with the tab key, it's usually the one to the left of Q. It doesn't always say tab, sometimes it has some arrows on it. Let's see if you can find it now. And a couple other notes are to double space the entire paper, just as you see here, as I mentioned, and use 1-inch margins on every side, which is usually the default setting in a word processing program, so you shouldn't have to change anything. Finally, use a readable font between 11 and 13 point. 12 is a good one to stick with if you're not sure. Another formatting feature you may be familiar with are subheadings, especially if you're familiar with APA. In MLA, subheadings are not encouraged, as the writing itself should transition the reader from idea to idea. But if they are necessary, possibly for longer papers like 4th year and graduate level, there are levels that you can follow to separate your work into sections if you wish. So level 1 would be the main level. And then level 2 would be subsections of level 1. And level 3 would be subsections, so subsections of the subsection level 2. It really would be quite rare to use level 2 and level 3 unless it's for a very long paper like a master's thesis. Your paper may occasionally include tables that you need to format. A table is a chart that either you build or you're citing from another source. Begin by numbering the table. You can see the table number here. Then add the title and add the source information under the table. Write source with a colon, followed by the table title, then the table author or source, the date, which got cut off here, and the URL if applicable. Include an access date as well if the source has been altered or if it's been removed from that source. And you might have more information about the table you want to share. You can add a note to the table by adding what's similar to a footnote to the title. This little A here. So this is called superscript. It's kind of like an exponent. And the very first one, if say you had more than one note, the first one would be A, the next one would be B, and so on. The A corresponds to the A down here to give more information about the table. More often, you may also need to format a figure. So a figure refers to an image. In this example, we have a photograph. Unlike the table, the figure number comes under the image with the full citation. The figure number and then all of the citation information. Now, don't worry if you don't remember all the details. You can always ask us at the Write Site, use the MLA website, or the University Library Guide on MLA to quickly remind you of these rules. And I've also sent you a copy of this PowerPoint and a handout so you can review how to format a table or a figure by looking at this PowerPoint. Now, the final part of a paper that needs formatting is the works cited page. So start a new page by inserting a page break to get you started. In most cases, you'll have more than one source, so write works cited with the S on the end of works. However, a funny little thing to remember is that if you're only citing one source, then use the heading work cited, only one work. Now, in general, we center the heading, unbolded, no colon at the top of the page. You can see that here. And you'll see that the citations are alphabetized by author's last name. And we also use a hanging indent where the first line is left aligned and all the subsequent lines are indented. So remember we saw indentation with the tab key. Here, don't use the tab key. It will make it very difficult to edit your works cited entries without getting kind of a messy problem. So instead, just select all of your entries, then go to paragraph settings, choose indentation, and then there's a section that says special, little drop-down menu that you can choose hanging indent from. So if you like a shortcut, you could use Control-T, and props to the student who taught me that. So you just select it all and do Control-T in Word. And in the works cited, continue to double space. Okay, so as promised, let's talk about citing sources. Why should we cite or document our sources? What's the point? Maybe you want to drop your answer in the chat. Why do you think this is important? I see that there's some questions that have come up. We'll come back to those in our next our Q&A, our first Q&A session. And Tinda, do you mind just typing in the chat so Jordy, who's having trouble hearing, just ask them to leave and come back. That usually fixes it. Thank you.
Will do.
Thanks. Okay, so people are saying it's important to give credit to the original work and avoid plagiarism. You want to make sure that your sources are reputable. These are really good answers. Provide acknowledgement where it's due. Okay, thanks for that. And thank you again, Tunda. Yeah, so the main reason that we want to cite is to give credit and thus avoid plagiarism. Many students are understandably concerned about unintentional plagiarism. If you're still concerned about it after our webinar, you might want to make an appointment with us to learn some more strategies. Plagiarism means presenting another person's work as your own. We always want to give credit to those with the original thought. Academic integrity means creating a document that's honest and indicates which thoughts you didn't originate. And fortunately, it's simple to avoid it. You'll just need to know how to paraphrase effectively, which means putting someone else's original thought into your own words and then citing it. If you're quoting, take the direct idea and put it in quotation marks, and again, cite it. If you've used APA, you may remember that paraphrases are preferred, but MLA is more favorable towards quotes, especially when the exact wording is important to your claim, which is often the case in English literature papers, for example, where you're supporting a point by analyzing the word choices. But you'll still find yourself often paraphrasing, which is important to do to show that you understand a concept. So paraphrasing and quoting are the two main ways to incorporate sources into your work. Paraphrasing can be tricky at first, so to avoid the stress of putting someone else's ideas into your own words, you can follow these steps. Read the passage, reread it if you need to, and then think about it while you put the passage away. While it's not in front of you, think about your understanding of it. Make sure that you have a solid comprehension of it. Then rephrase it in your own voice with your own vocabulary, phrasing, sentence structure, and style. Then add the author and page number at the end of the sentence. That's your citation in MLA. So let's look at an example from Cinema Speculation by Quentin Tarantino. The original quote is, "Both Taxi Driver and Rolling Thunder offer a cracked mirror, blistering critique of the vigilante genre." To paraphrase, the films Taxi Driver and Rolling Thunder subvert the genre of vigilante cinema by questioning its signature elements. Tarantino 254. So you want to make sure that you understand the original idea, think about it, then without that original in front of you, draft your own paraphrase that shows your understanding of it. Another step that you can then take is go back and make sure you accurately translated the idea into your own words, and also to make sure that you didn't accidentally borrow too much wording from the original. And then there's quoting. So for quoting, again, use it when the exact wording is important. Put it in quotation marks, double quotation marks. Integrate the quotation into the grammar of your sentence. And then cite. Add the author and page number at the end of the sentences. Or if you mention the author in the sentence, then you only need the page number at the end, as we'll see. If there's no page number, then just omit that part. We don't give a paragraph number or other alternative unless it's actually numbered that way. And we'll talk more about that. Now note that if you make any alterations to the quote, use square brackets as an indication. You'll see that with the square brackets around changing here. This is just a fake quote. Now, why would you do this? Well, this can help you to successfully integrate the quote into the grammar of your sentence, like by changing the tense of a verb or indicating a character's name where it just gave the pronoun he, she, they. So again, an example. The original, the same one we saw. Oh, there's a mistake with the quotation mark there. Sorry about that. That should be tied up against the period. And then the quote, Tarantino writes that Taxi Driver and Rolling Thunder create, quote, cracked, mirror, blistering critiques, unquote, of their genre. 254. So you can see why the writer would quote cracked mirror, blistering critiques. That's very unique wording. It might be that that wording is very important for the writer to then go on and analyze what that means in terms of these films. And another thing you can see is how the quote is integrated into the grammar of the sentence. Tarantino's name is in the sentence, and then part of the idea is given in the writer's words, followed by Tarantino's quote, and then the page number at the end. Another thing I'll mention here is just not to let a quote stand alone. After this, it would be important to explain its significance. Now, sometimes you actually don't need to cite information. MLA guidelines explain you don't need to cite common knowledge. Our assistant coordinator, Tunda, who's here with us today, has described common knowledge this way. It can be considered common knowledge if you stop 100 people on the street and 95 knew the idea. So, for example, climate change is prevalent in the world today. Common knowledge. You wouldn't need a source to support that. However, if your paper is about that, you would go and find more specific details about that, and you would cite those. Now, you don't need to quote passing mentions where you don't use information or ideas from the text. So, for example, this reminds me of my favorite film, The Godfather. Just mentioning The Godfather, not discussing it in any more detail. Just kind of casual. And finally, you don't need to quote allusions. These are references to other people or texts, usually famous. So, for example, they described the new girl as having a face that launched 1,000 ships, referring to a famous passage from Christopher Marlowe about Helen of Troy. All right, so I know some questions were coming up about some of these topics. We might get to some of the answers later, but I'll come back to the chat and take a look. Okay, so Kuati, hopefully I'm getting your name right there, asked, do you add numbers with the course? So for the course information at the top of the page, got your name, professor's name, and the name of the course. So MLA style would just give the name of the course, but you could always check with your instructor if they'd like you to include the course code as well, like ENGL 302.
Jacqueline is asking if there's a file naming convention. I'm not sure if I know what she means by that. Maybe you would like to address the question, Sargin?
Maybe for how you name the file to then submit it for your instructor. That would be kind of your instructor's preference. Some courses and disciplines do ask you how, like a specific way to like what information to include. Like, for example, I'm taking some courses in the Faculty of Business, and I have to give my last name followed by my first initial, followed by the course code, followed by the assignment number. But you should be given that information if somebody wants it. Tunda, do you have anything to say on that?
Oh, I love your answer. Thank you. If Jacqueline is satisfied with it. I would like to go to the next question. I was kind of pondering this and trying to figure out what's going on there. So Oceana is asking, when you were sharing with us the Works Cited page, that the first entry has HTTPS for the link, and the third one has only the website. So what's the difference? Why do we do it this way?
That's a good question. I didn't notice that, Oceana, so I'd have to go back and double check that. So let me make a note of that. I'm going to look into that. And then I can email you that answer. I'm sorry that I don't have it right off the top of my head, but That's a really good question. Thanks, Oceana.
Thank you, Sarah Jean. And it looks like the other two students that you replied to are happy with their answers. And there's another question. Is punctuation always before the ending quotation mark in Canadian conventions? So where do you put the punctuation? Inside the quotation mark or outside? It's a frequent question.
Yeah, that's a really good question, Kwati. In MLA, it depends on the punctuation mark. So a period or a comma would come after the citation. But if it's a question mark, if it's an exclamation point, it would come inside the quote. The reason for that is kind of that the exclamation or the question mark is part of that quote that you're giving, but a period or a comma, it kind of becomes part of your sentence. But your sentence doesn't have a question mark or an exclamation point. So that's kind of a way to remember it. I hope that answers your question. And yes, just in general, the Canadian convention, I believe we go with American, which is to put it inside the quotation mark. British, I believe, would be outside. But think in terms of the style guide that you're using first.
And be consistent. That's one of the things we always have to mention to the students, that try not to mix the British approach with the US approach. And then Canadian kind of uses both. So make sure that you keep consistent all through the paper and follow the same style.
That's a good point. I'm glad you were able to join us at Aronke, and too bad, Jordy, that didn't work. I'm glad that Jordy received the PowerPoints, though. Okay, we'll get back to the presentation then, because we've still got a lot to cover. Thanks for your great questions. Okay, so on to the requirements for in-text citations themselves. So in-text citations are references in the body of the paper that direct your readers to the full citations at the end on the works cited page. And there are two ways to incorporate sources into your writing. Narrative citations mention the author in the body of the sentence, like this. Tarantino writes that, page number at the end. So this is a narrative citation. It's in your sentence. These are useful if you're just building skills in academic writing because they give you convenient sentence starters known as signal phrases. So a signal phrase is made up of the author's name, followed by a verb that shows what the author does or how they say it, like Tarantino writes or Tarantino explores. And notice that for a paraphrase or quote, the page number should come in parentheses at the end of the sentence. Unlike APA, which only requires a page number when quoting, MLA requires a page number even when paraphrasing. And here's a paraphrasing example. Tarantino explores the genres of cinema in the 1970s, beginning with Scorsese's Taxi Driver. Oh, sorry. No, this one is not a paraphrase. This is why it does not have a citation. This is a summary. Yeah, so a summary does not require a page number because it's talking about the work as a whole, Tarantino's work as a whole. There isn't a page number to assign to it. But if I went on to discuss details of Tarantino's exploration of the 1970s genres of cinema, I would need to provide a page number for each paraphrase or quote. There's our signal phrases right there. There's our page number. And we can go on to parenthetical citations. The parenthetical citations only mention the author in the citation at the end of the sentence. Like this. We give the quote integrated into the sentence, followed by Tarantino 223. And this is useful if you want to emphasize the idea instead of whose idea it is. So we don't put Tarantino's name in the sentence because we want to emphasize the idea rather than the author. So let's focus on some different kinds of parenthetical citations. First and foremost, however, do not separate author and page number with a comma, like between in-text citation information and APA. There's no comma, there's nothing there, just a space. And if the citation comes at the end of the sentence, add a period to the end of it. We were kind of getting at that with the question earlier about where does the punctuation go. The citation is kind of considered part of the sentence. So the period comes after you give the citation, not at the end of your wording or the quote. So when we know the author and have page numbers, we format the citation like this. One author, like we saw above, identified by the last name. Two authors have the word "and" written between them. And more than two use et al. After the first author's last name. Remember the period after et al. Because it's an abbreviation. It's Latin and it means et alia, or it stands for et alia, meaning and others, Smith and others. There's no period after et because that's a single word, and. Now, we may not have a human author, but an organizational author, like in the printing of reports. In that case, the organization becomes the author, like Statistics Canada. Some texts don't have known authors at all, so we use a title or a shortened title instead. So this is common with web pages, news articles, encyclopedia or dictionary entries. Now, if the title is more than one phrase long, you can shorten it to the first phrase so it doesn't take up too much space or take away from your writing. So in this example, we've given a simplified guide as the shortened first phrase of a simplified guide to randomized control trials. And if there is no page number, omit the page number and use only the author name, as I mentioned. More and more, we're dealing with online articles that don't have page numbers. So you might find that you're encountering this more often. Some articles may have paragraph numbers printed by the publisher in the margin, but don't count them yourself and only include them if they've been provided. So here we see an exception to the default citation of author page number with no comma. If you do have to describe the type of number you're giving, like para for paragraph, sec for section, chap for chapter, or line, then you will use a comma after the author's name to avoid confusion. But remember, only include any of those if they're given. Don't count them yourself. We may have a page range where we indicate the range with a hyphen if your quote or paraphrase occurs over 2 pages. But don't give a range of like 5 pages. Your paraphrase doesn't go over 5 pages. Give separate page number citations for where each part came from. And page numbers may also appear as Roman numerals, like in a prologue or some kind of chapter that comes before the book begins. So use Roman numerals instead of the usual Arabic numerals. Now, usually we're dealing with journal articles, government documents, books, and online articles in our essays. However, we may have to confront a text we're unsure of how to cite. There's no need to memorize this, though. Know that rules exist, and you might just have to research it on your own or ask one of us at the Write Site for help. So here we have poetry, where in the quote we use slashes to indicate a line break or the end of a line. And in this narrative citation, you'll see that the word lines is included before the line numbers. And in the parenthetical citation, you'll see another example of that exception I mentioned, where we do add a comma after the author's name because the word lines comes before the numbers. Otherwise, the numbers would appear to be page numbers if we didn't give the word lines, and that's not correct. However, MLA advises that once you've established that you're referring to lines, you don't need to continually repeat the word lines in every citation. It should be clear, okay, you're talking about poetry, and it's always going to be that line number. Plays use acts and scenes, which we may need to quote in this order: act, scene, line. So think of Shakespeare if you studied it in high school. The acts are the biggest sections, the scenes are the subsections of the acts, and then specific lines have quotes that you may want to draw from. In this case, no comma will be needed because periods actually come between act, scene, and line. And that makes clear also that we're not referring to page numbers, so you don't need to include the word line. And just to mention with the play name here, you might use the play name if, say, you're referring to multiple Shakespeare plays. So that will show which one you're referring to now. You would only have to give that title in the citation if it's not already clear that you're referring to Hamlet. If you've already mentioned that in your paragraph and it's clear, you can just go right to act, scene, and line. And scripture, religious texts, they're often organized like plays, except into books, chapters, and verses. And here we have the book of Deuteronomy, followed by chapter 2 and verse 8. And here are some examples that, again, you can come back to if you find yourself working with an audiovisual text like a play, video, or TV episode. Dialogue from these texts includes the speaking character's name in all capitals at the beginning of an indented line. So you can see it's indented there. This is treated like a block quotation, which we'll see just soon here. And at the end, you can see the parenthetical citation. Now, this example shows how to place the citation if it doesn't fit on the final line of the block quotation. Then you put it on the next line and align it to the right of the page. So just imagine this didn't fit up here. We put it on the next line and align it to the right. Scenes from a long piece like a film are cited differently from scenes from a short piece like a TV episode. From a film, give the name of the film, followed by the timestamp of hour, minute, second, separated by colons to show the time. And scenes from a shorter episode use the title of the episode in quotation marks, again followed by the timestamp. And we'll see a similar practice later on as all types of shorter texts use quotation marks around them, while all types of longer texts use the slanted italics font. So this is similar to referring to titles in text in APA. So as I mentioned before, a block quote, this is a direct quote, but it's one that's 4 lines or more in your essay. And this one's a little bit short. It's probably not 4 lines, but let's pretend it is 4 lines in the text of your essay. The whole quote is shown indented 1/2 inch from the left-hand margin. Again, just like the dialogue was. It's the same width as the tab key. Here you can use the tab key by first indenting the first line. So say you had this written out, then you bring your cursor here and indent the first line. It will only indent the first line at first, but then come down to the second line and indent the second one, and then all of them will jump over. So you only need to indent the first and the second. They should all jump over to indentation then. And in this example, the first line leading into the quote is our words as the author introducing the quote. As I've mentioned, all quotes should be integrated into your sentence. And this example shows one strategy of doing that, which is to introduce the quote with a bit of paraphrasing or analysis, followed by a colon. Then the indented quote begins. And you'll notice here that the formatting is a bit different from a normal parenthetical citation. Here the period goes at the end of the quote, instead of at the end of the citation. So that's an exception. Block quotes, the period or punctuation comes before the citation. The citation has no punctuation after it. And your text would begin again on the next line. Let's review some punctuation as it relates to quotations. We already discussed the use of square brackets to make changes. But here's an example of changing the capital of the first word of the quote to a lowercase letter to fit the grammar of the sentence. Also be sure to distinguish your own ideas from your source. And you can freely change a period to a comma in the quote if the sentence of the quote ends in the middle of your sentence. So basically what that means is distinguish your own ideas from your source. Your sentence continues, but this one ends. This one had a period in the original. You can replace that with a comma without showing that alteration. That, in fact, shows that that possibly was the end of the sentence. Or it was a comma, but you can switch it to a comma so that it fits the grammar of your sentence. And then the citation comes at the end with the period. You wouldn't put this comma here if the citation came right after it. You would just give the period, but in this case, to fit the grammar of your sentence, you switch that period to a comma. A little confusing, I know. I hope that made sense. And when using quotes within quotes, use single quotation marks for the inner quotation. So here you can notice the 3 apostrophe-like marks at the end of the sentence, or at the end of the quote. There's a single quotation mark followed by a double quotation mark. No space or anything else in between. Just showing the single quote, which is the quote within the quote ended, and then the larger quote ends. So that's what it looks like if they touch each other, the quote within the longer quote. I can't remember if I touch on this later, so I'll just mention too, quoted in is used to show that actually this quote is taken from Canavan, but it was quoting Octavia Butler. So you can use QTD period in quoted in Canavan if you're taking a quote of somebody else who was quoted by the essay you read. Now we've been talking a lot about quotations, so let's just have a reminder about paraphrasing. Once you've read and understood what you want to paraphrase, you put that original text away. Otherwise, it's too easy to transfer over that exact wording or sentence structure. That can result in accidental plagiarism. So let's look at an example. Poloniak's use of allusions and nuanced characterization offers English instructors rich teaching material. This is the original. So we want to put that original away. And remember, it is a little bit tough because you haven't come across these ideas before, and this may not be the field that you're studying, English. But when you do this yourself, you'll have a more solid understanding because you're actually studying it. But there's the original quote. We need to put it away and then paraphrase it as we understand it. Poloniak's use of literary devices enriches its entertainment value in the classroom. Give that citation afterwards. So when you write about the idea, here's another tip. Write it as though you're explaining it to someone else who doesn't know about this topic. How would you put it in words if you're explaining it to someone you know? This is the way to ensure that the idea will be written in your words and will be clear. And then again, afterwards, you can check the original for correctness of the idea, compare them, and make sure that you didn't borrow too close of wording. When you have a couple of sentences in a row citing from the same source, you only need to include the last name when the source changes. So, for example, as long as you're writing about citron here, you've already identified citron and only the page number needs to be given. for each quote or paraphrase. Then next, oh, this isn't Citron, this is Anderson. So you give Anderson's name. As long as you're talking about Anderson, again, only the page number is needed, and so on. If you're writing a paper about a single source, you don't need to repeat the author's name at the beginning of each paragraph as you would in APA. Only the page numbers are required, and it's presumed that you're still discussing the same source you introduced previously. This is a really nice part about MLA. Now, this essay is from an English course our writing coach Kara took, and you can see that she interacts with the text primarily through specific quotations, and this helps her to do an effective literary analysis. So if you're writing about literature, and you don't rely enough on quotes, your paper might end up looking like a summary of the text. So it's very important to take direct quotes, usually not long block quotes. You should avoid those, but try to take short, unique quotes that are important for you to explain to support your main idea about the text. Now, with formatting titles and containers, we do see a lot of errors with this one, but with practice, you will be able to memorize these rules. So as I mentioned earlier, long forms are italicized, and these include books, documentaries, films, and reports. Titles of short forms are expressed through the double quotation marks, and these include poems, articles, and short stories, as well as TV episodes, as we saw. Remember, these are titles we're talking about. The title of the poem is in quotation marks. The title of the book is in italics. In MLA, a container is something that contains a text. So examples include journals, anthologies, and databases, which also have names. So like longer forms, italicize the container title. This makes sense. The containers themselves are longer texts, longer compilations of texts. So for example, a physical copy of a journal volume in a library, it's a big book containing multiple issues with several articles within it. So it's a long form, you would italicize it. Okay, so before we go on to works cited, let's see what questions have been coming up.
I have noticed a bit of confusion. For example,
Okay.
one of the questions refers to whether we're using footnotes in MLA. And my answer would be that footnotes are used mostly in Chicago. But if you would like to add something to that, Sarah Jean. And then another question was, if we're writing a paper, only one book, then do we use the author's last name and year plus page number? So here's again another confusion. The year is used in APA. In MLA, we use only author and page number. And yes, Blessing, you are assuming correctly. So if it's only one book, usually you would go by paragraph. At the beginning of the paragraph, you use the full citation. So you include the author's last name and page number. And if it's the same book and you're not switching to something else, you don't have to use the full citation, just add the page numbers. So that's just a little summary of what I saw as a bit of a confusion. And then one more specific question. Oceana is asking, how do you cite peer-reviewed articles from the AU library? Like, do you need to find the original source instead? So these two questions, if you would like to add something more to footnotes and Chicago mix-up, and the AU library question. Thank you.
Thanks, Chinda. Yes, so footnotes are not used for citations at all in MLA. And they would probably be rare to use. If you find that you do want to give a footnote, it's usually to give some extra information, not the citation information, but some extra information. It's better to just try to fit it in the body of your text. If it doesn't fit, if it seems it's extra, you might not even need it at all. But if you do need help with formatting that, feel free to reach out, but never use it for a citation in MLA. for the question about peer-reviewed articles from the AU library, those usually would be the original source. They're, say, a study or a theoretical article that someone has written, maybe in the humanities. We would consider that an original source. Now, if they quoted somebody, you want to quote that quote. It is best practice to find the original. You're right. I didn't mention that. So thanks for that point, Oceana. If you can't find it, though, you can use that quoted in trick, the QTD period in. And let me know in the chat if that's answering your question so I can expand if needed. So Blessing, just to say a little bit more about the confusion with the when do you need to keep citing. So in MLA, generally, say you're only writing about one article. Say you're doing like a critical article review. You just introduce it at the beginning, and from there on, you can just give the page number. So that's nice about MLA. You don't need to keep giving the author name. You probably will if you're doing a critical review. You'll probably mention the author in your sentences anyway. But technically, you don't have to keep giving it in the citation. In APA, you would have to make it very clear you're still referring to the same source. So the rules are a bit different. So if you want to go over that with APA, then definitely come talk to us. But MLA, it's established that the last source you mentioned is the one you're discussing. It never hurts to give the author again if it's been a while. You know, use your best judgment in that way. I hope that helps. Really good questions. Okay, yeah. So Oceana asked, how do I indicate to my tutor that the information was from the AU library when it's part of the requirement if I just cite it from original? Okay, so that's where you give the database. The database is the container of the journal. So the journal contained the article, the database contained the journal. And so if you give the database name, then your instructor would be able to see that you used one of the databases that AU Library subscribes to. Does that sound right to you, Tunda? Okay, awesome. Yeah, so MLA does ask you to include the database name. So I'll show you in the works cited examples how we would do that. Awesome questions, thank you. Okay, so let's build the works cited page. So to create a works cited, we're going to need some important information. First, we need the author, and then we need a title. And these are the two main pieces of information about the text, the author and then the title. Then we need to gather information about the container. So remember, this is where we found the source, maybe in a journal, on a website, in an anthology, and look for the title of the container. If the container has a volume or an issue number, if it has a publisher, and a date, publication date. And if necessary, also add a URL or DOI. Now, citations can be very picky about punctuation. They can also be tricky to remember when we're writing multiple papers in multiple documentation styles. So I hope this will make it easy to remember. Periods are used to separate the major items of author from title and title from the container. So author period, title period. Then commas are used to separate all the rest of the information about the container. Version, volume, number, publisher, page numbers. You can see all those commas in there. Then a period at the end of the container. Oops, sorry about that. So in MLA, a works cited entry always ends on a period, even after URL or a DOI. And that contrasts to APA, which has no period after URL or DOI. So think of the whole works cited as a paragraph of information, and it has maybe 3 or 4 sentences. One is the author, one is the title, one is the first container, one is the second container, and it always ends on a period. So finally, you'll also see periods that abbreviate words like volume to VOL and page range to PP. So let's go over some of the abbreviations you'll commonly find in your works cited entries. The edition of a book is abbreviated to ED period. Volume is abbreviated to VOL period. So this one's common for journal articles. And by the way, a volume that contains books instead of articles is an example of a second container. So some sources have multiple containers, like a journal and a database. The journal is the first container. The database is the second container. Or with books, a book could be a container of a chapter, and a volume could be a container of the book. So again, we'll see soon what it looks like to have multiple containers. Journal articles also often have an issue number, abbreviated as NO period for number. The page range of an article or chapter is abbreviated by PP period. And we've already seen at AL period, which is used in MLA on the works cited page for sources with more than 2 authors, not just in in-text citations. So MLA actually uses at AL on the works cited page as well. So here's a reason to celebrate if you've ever done an article with 20 authors in APA. Here it would only be one author's name, et al. Now this is MLA's quick guide to help you create your works cited entries. So again, you can see the period separating the major items, author period, title period, and then use commas to separate all the information about the container, then end on the period. If the source has 2 containers, not much changes, except that another container is added. Remember, each container ends on a period, with the commas separating all the internal information about the container. So put commas between all the information about the first container, period. Begin the next container. It too will separate its internal information with commas, and then end on a period. So remember, a second container could be like a volume or a set of books that has volumes. It could be a database. So you'll probably mostly use it as a database. Okay, let's go through some examples of works cited entries for different types of sources: books, articles, web pages, and so on. So it's not exhaustive, but we'll go through the most common texts that are cited. And remember, even for other types of texts, you would use this same pattern that we see here in the quick guide. So that's nice. All will always apply. This will always apply to all source types. So let's start with a book. You can split the entry into the components that need to be included. First is the author, Quentin Tarantino. Place the last name first, then a comma, then the first name, followed by a period. The book title is Cinema Speculation, italicized. So these are the 2 major components about the source. And remember that periods follow them: author period, title period. Next comes the publication information. First, the publisher name, a comma, and then the publication date, period. So remember, these 2, the publisher and date, have a comma between them, and then the entry ends on the period. So now let's look at an item in an anthology. So note that the text in this example is only 1 page long. Usually you put the page range of the source, where here you see just a single page number. This is a short poem, it's only on 1 page. Usually you give a page range with PP period. So again, for the author, remember to begin with the last name, Harris, Claire. And the last name corresponds with the name used in the in-text citation for this source. So you would refer to her as Harris throughout your text. And note that the title of a short work, again, is in quotation marks. MLA uses title case capitalization with all the major words in a title capitalized. All titles, your title of your paper, the title of a short work in quotation marks, the title of a long work italicized, always MLA uses title case capitalization, capitalizing all the major words. This is different than APA, and this is another thing that makes MLA nice. It's very consistent. So again, celebrate. If you have to switch from APA to MLA, there are things that make it easier. Next up is the container information. So the first 2 components have the periods after them, and now all the container information will be separated by commas. First, the title of the container, which is a book, a long work, so the title is italicized. For editors or translators, write out edited by or translated by. So we don't have any abbreviations there, you write it out. Put that in front of the name, edited by Carol Morrill. Every name in the works cited entry except the very first one is given in the regular order in English of first name, last name, as you can see here with Carol Morrill. Whereas we had Harris Claire at the beginning, but any other name that appears in the works cited entry will be first, last. Now the publisher, the date, which is the year of the container's publication, and then the page number or page range. And commas between all of those, ending on a period. Author period, title period, commas between all the container information, period. Here's a journal article. Begin with the author. And title, again, notice that title case is used even for article and book titles, which is unlike APA, because APA would use sentence case. So remember that consistency, always use title case, just really nice. Now the container information. The title. This is the journal title. The journal volume, which is formatted as that abbreviation we've seen, VOL period, 46. Issue number, NO period. This one has a double issue, 9 to 10. Usually it'd only be one number, but sometimes they are combined. This one's date has a month, though some may only have a year. And here you can see what a page range looks like with the double P for the abbreviation followed by a period. Finally, the URL. Now here's a nice part as well. If the URL is more than 3 lines long in your paper, you can truncate or shorten it as seen here. So even with a URL, then end the entry on a period. And here's an example of a web page without an author. Skip right to the source title. Children account for 40% of cholera cases in Haiti. Follow it by a period, then give the container information. Al Jazeera, comma. 23rd November 2022, comma. URL. Imagine this one was more than 3 lines long. I shortened it, period. And here's a web page for a known author. The author's name, last comma, first, period. The title, in quotation marks because it's a short article on a web page, period. The title of the container, Calgary Herald, it's a long work, because it's collecting all those news articles together. And I'm sorry, it also should have been italicized up here. The date of publication and the URL followed by a period. Now remember, you're only supposed to shorten it if it goes past 3 lines. I did here because it wouldn't fit, but you can if this was a very long URL, which you will often have with your journal articles, because they're that really long like path of how you finally found that article. Those ones you might be able to truncate. Now we've done these examples, so let's put them onto a works cited page. Remember the punctuation and formatting rules from before. Start with the title, works cited. Now, let's look at the authors. Make sure that they're alphabetized by the last name or the first word of the title when there's no author. Then the title comes in its place. And end that author component on a period. Now let's add the title. Do you remember how you can tell which ones are short works and which ones are long works? If you can, maybe you could pop that in the chat. And while I'm waiting on that, notice that also after the title, we add that period, because author and title are the 2 main important pieces of information for an MLA works cited entry. Name, period, title, period. And the other thing you'll notice here is that with the one that has no author, we're not adding another title. The title is in the author position. So how can you tell which ones are the short texts and which ones are the long texts? Do you remember? Yeah, that's right. Natalia mentioned longer works in italics, shorter works in quotations. And there's some questions there we can get to in a little bit here. So now let's add the container. So the container title is always italicized. The container is always a long work because it contains shorter works. However, if the source is a long work and it doesn't really have a true container, like a book, we saw that earlier on, don't italicize the publisher, for example. The publisher is not a container title, it's a publisher. So italicize the title of a container. But if there is no container title, you go through that list that we saw, title of container, contributor, version number. If there's none of that, we go right to publisher. And then that is not italicized, as you can see with Goose Lane here, because Goose Lane is the publisher, but it's not a container title. So remember back to the MLA template we saw. Here you can see that the title of container is separate from the publisher. Title of container, publisher is down here. So a works cited entry for a book is a good example of a source that omits a lot of these container details. And again, that's what you should do to fill in this template. Just omit components that aren't part of the source. So for a book, after author period, title period, unless there's a version, unless there's an editor or translator, go right to publisher. And so just check if it has that information. This is kind of a checklist. But remember, a book doesn't usually have a title of a container. So here's the rest of the information about the container separated by commas. So again, you can see that in some cases, components are omitted. They won't be given for every single works cited entry. So use that as a guide and fill in what you can. Now, for example, only the article here has the volume and issue number. None of the other ones have versions. None of the other ones have issue number. So that's omitted. And now we add the URL or DOI. So the access date is the day that you added the information. Sorry about that. It's not a required element in your citation. But the MLA Style Center suggests including an access date when no date of publication is available, or if you suspect that the work may be altered or removed. We touched on that earlier. But it's usually not required to add an access date. Next, double check the hanging indents. So this means the first line of the citation is that flush left. The subsequent lines are indented. And there's a little video here that you can watch to help you through that. And then you can also remember just that shortcut Control T. Just select all of them, and then Control T. And voila, it's done. As I mentioned before, there are so many different source types that you might somehow have to cite. Maybe even a ballet. Maybe you go to a ballet and you're going to do an analysis of it. Maybe it's a dissertation or a thesis. Don't worry, all of these, you use the same guide, this container review, this guide, this order of elements, omit the ones that aren't included, fill in which ones are.